Hey everybody, Rob here at etrailer.com, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Roadmaster rear anti-sway bar on our 2019 Coachmen Mirada Motorhome. Here at etrailer.com, we get a lot of questions about motorhomes, specifically about suspension upgrades. Because let's face it, whether you're new to driving a motorhome or you've been doing it for a while, you'll realize real quickly that they're very top heavy and altogether just a very large vehicle. And once you start driving, you notice all the little things that are going on. You kind of feel that swaying feeling going on. It kind of feels a little bit loose in the steering wheel. Well, that can be unnerving for a lot of people because how big it is, we don't really feel like we're in quite as much control as we want. Not to mention, if we have a dip in the road, the steering wants to pull us to the side, we end up fighting that steering wheel. Well, even if you're not driving and you're in the back of the motorhome, well, you're probably getting tossed around and it's not that enjoyable. So all those little things really add up over time, and by the time we get to our destination, we're going to be exhausted from either moving in our seat, trying to get comfortable, fighting the steering wheel, and just trying to keep our motorhome straight and tracking the way it should. So before we put any kind of suspension components on our motorhome, we're going to take it on our test course and see how it handles the way it is now. Immediately feel a really big body roll. It's almost like the motorhome wants to lean and then go into the turn. Now on the bumps course here, that softness kind of goes away because once we hit the bump, it's not an extremely hard bump, but you can feel it kind of going through the seat, resonating through the floor. But what I really think the problem is, not necessarily the bump itself, more of the after effect. We go over the bump and I can feel the motorhome kind of still hopping around and it doesn't want to react as quick. And then especially when we come to the alternating speed bumps here, it kind of lurches to one side and then lurches back the other way. Again, I'm really just have to make sure I have a firm grip and paying attention to what's going on because the motorhome's kind of wanting to go where it wants to go and I have to fight it. And even just driving through the parking lot with some of the uneven pavement and little potholes that are around, you definitely can feel that. But again, because of how soft it is, it's not really a problem there. It's just more of a control issue. And as we're going through the parking lot here, I'm just idling. And as I turn the steering wheel back and forth, we're still traveling straight, but you can actually see the entire windshield shifting and how much roll it actually has to it. But now that we got our parts installed, let's take our motorhome back on our test course and see how everything improved. Now as I come up to my slalom course, again we'll be running about 10 miles an hour to try to keep it as close to that baseline run as we had. I can already feel a difference just going through the parking lot, and honestly as I come in and out of the turns, it doesn't feel like it's swaying anywhere near as much. It does feel a lot more planted. And it's just a lot easier to go in and out of the turns. I'm not having to grab the steering wheel and rip it back to come back to center. It just naturally kind of wants to ease in and out of the turns. It's a lot more comfortable. I just feel like I have a lot more control. Now as I come up to my bumps course, again, we're running about 5 miles an hour just to keep a nice baseline. But I can already tell a difference. Don't get me wrong, the bumps are still there, obviously. But they're not as jarring. I'm not really getting that coming through the seat. Not to mention, once we get over the bump, the motorhome just kind of wants to level out and not continue to bounce. And that's really the biggest thing. Which that's really the point of all of our suspension upgrades, is so that we can drive our motorhome, have the confidence, and actually enjoy it rather than being nervous. So I can definitely tell a difference between the before and the after. Because again, it's all about the feeling that we get whenever we're driving our motorhome so we can confidently get where we're going. And again, not have to fight that steering wheel, keep adjusting in our seat, and actually be able to enjoy it rather than making it a stressful situation. One thing I do want to mention is we did put on several different suspension components, and that's what I would suggest anyway. If you're going to be doing the front or the back, you might as well do both so we can get the most stability out of our motorhome all the way from the front of it to the back so we don't have to worry about any of those problems that may arise. So we actually ended up putting on front sumo springs along with rear sumo springs, the front steering stabilizer, and the rear sway bar. So all those things combined together are going to give us all those results that we did see on our test course. So here's what our Roadmaster Anti-Sway Bar looks like once we have it fully installed. Now you'll notice that this is going to be an additional sway bar on top of the factory one. So it's not going to replace it, it's actually going to give us more support that we need in the back end. Now an anti-sway bar is going to do for side-to-side movement what a good pair of shocks does for up and down movement. It's going to attach directly to our rear axle and the frame, and it's going to use the axle to brace the frame and keep that transfer from happening. So whenever we have a big turn, one side wants to lean down, well, as it's pulling on that, it's going to be using the axle as leverage to keep it moving too much, so it's going to want to stay in that neutral leveled state. Now every bushing that's on our sway bar here is going to be a polyurethane bushing. And that's going to give us a few different advantages. One, they're going to last longer than the standard rubber and be less resistant to any kind of damage to them, whether it be automotive chemicals, UV rays. They're just not going to break down as easy as rubber. And they're also going to be a little bit more stiffer than rubber, so they're going to give us that support we need without getting that mushy feeling. But at the same time, they're also going to have just enough pivot and movement in there to allow the transfer of weight from one side whenever we do take a sharp turn. The sway bar itself is going to be 1.5 inches in diameter and be made out of 4140 chrome moly steel. So it's going to be thick and extra durable, and again, it's there to give us additional support on top of our factory sway bar, not replace it. But that's also a really nice thing about it, is it is going to work with the factory sway bar and a lot of other aftermarket components. We're not going to have to worry about any kind of interference. The sway bar itself is going to come with everything you need to get it installed, and one of my favorite parts of it is that we're not going to have to drill any holes or modify our motorhome in any way. Now I do realize that a lot of us don't have any kind of lifting devices at home, like a lift, to really lift our motorhome up off the ground, but we can actually get this installed with all the tires still on the ground. So we'll go and give you a few tips and tricks of how to get everything in place, just to make it a little bit easier for you at home. In fact, let's go ahead and do that together now. To begin our installation, we want to park our motorhome on a nice flat level surface. We're going to apply the parking brake. Now we're going to use our leveling jacks to raise the back end up. Now you'll notice I still have the tires on the ground. We don't need to have them lifted up, but we do need that little bit of stretch in the suspension. Because if we actually come to the wheel.Well here and we look inside, we'll find 2 bolts that are only accessible if we have it lifted up because of where the leaf springs are. So these 2 bolts on the bottom that are directly behind the leaf spring there, when the motorhome's on its full weight, the leaf springs actually block those bolts to where we can't pull them out. But we do need to pull both of the bottom bolts out, so we're going to grab a 21mm socket and possibly an extension if you need one to reach. I don't know if you noticed, but on the inside of the frame rail here, there's actually a nut plate. And it's going to fall off on its own, which is perfectly fine. It's just going to keep us from having to hold a wrench on the back side. So you want to grab the bolts and the backing plates and make sure you hold on to them. This is what those little nuts on the back side look like. And I got those tabs on there, so once they start spinning, they hit the frame and it'll hold it in place so we don't have to have that wrench. So we want to grab our frame bracket. It's going to have a kind of an L shape with 2 tabs coming down. We'll also notice that it's going to have 2 holes. We want to make sure that the 2-hole flat section is on the outside of the frame, so it'll line up with those 2 holes just like that, and then we'll reuse the factory hardware to secure everything down. So we just want to line everything up with the factory holes. We'll pass the bolt through the bracket, make sure it goes through the frame. And then on the back side, we'll make sure we put that nut plate back in. We'll do that for both mounting holes and all the hardware we have. And the nut plate, I will let you know, it's probably going to be easier to spin the bolt while you just kind of hold the nut in place, because that tab is going to make it extremely difficult to rotate around. So we just want to make sure that we get it started at least on the bolt and that it's not cross-threading. And again, just make sure you get both pieces of hardware into the frame and they're both started and the bracket's not going to fall off. We'll just grab that same 21mm socket and tighten up both the bolts. Now once you have that one bracket in on one side, you're going to repeat the same process on the other side. And again, just make sure that bracket's on the outside and those two tabs are facing down. Now we're going to move underneath our motorhome directly behind the rear axle. Now, attached to our rear axle, we're going to have our shocks be attached to the shock mount on the bottom here. We need to remove the lower section of the shock so we can actually get behind it to the shock mount. So you want to grab yourself an 1 1/8" wrench to hold one side. Then we'll go an 1 1/8" socket to remove the nut or bolt, depending on which side you're holding it on. Now once you remove the hardware, you want to make sure that you hold on to all of it. So we'll have a washer and a nut on one side, and then a bolt with a washer on the other side. So you want to make sure you have both of those washers and the nut and bolt. But then for now, we can just kind of grab our shock. We're just going to pull it, kind of move it to the side. If we look in the shock mount, we'll see two holes, and those are going to be our mounting locations on each side. So we want to go ahead and pull the shock bolt and remove the shock out of the lower section on the other side as well. For the top hole, we're going to grab the 3/8" bolt out of our kit. We want to make sure we put a flat washer over it. And we'll come from the back side of the shock mount, and we want to drop the bolt through so it comes out that upper hole. It's a little bit of a tight fit, but we should be able to get that bolt in there. If you're having a little bit of trouble, you can use a 9/16 socket to thread it in, or just get a wrench or a small hammer or anything and you can tap it in place. You're going to make sure that bolt's coming all the way down through and we don't have any of it sticking out the back side. Now on the bottom, it's going to be relatively the same, but we're going to use a different bolt. We want to grab the cap head bolt out of our kit. We'll have a rounded section to it. And we still do need to put a flat washer on, but we're going to have a flat washer that's actually cut. That way it won't take up all this space and be hanging out down the bottom. So make sure that our bolt goes through the washer. And we'll pass the bolt through the lower hole. And again, it might be a little bit of a tight fit, so you can use a 7/32 Allen key or socket to thread it in, or again, just tap it in with a small wrench, hammer, or whatever you have available. Just want to make sure it goes through all the way, and again, that the flat section of that washer is towards the bottom so it's not hanging out. And it's going to be the same combination on both shock mounts, so we'll go ahead and repeat the same process on the other side. Now one thing I do want to mention is we want to leave our shocks out and loose for now until we get our sway bar in place, because otherwise we're not going to be able to reach back here and tighten up all the hardware. So at this point we can come out from underneath our motorhome and prepare the bar itself. So we want to make sure we grab our bar, both sets of clamps, and the bushings out of our kit. Now they're also going to provide us with some lubricant, and this is going to make it to where whenever we're driving down the road, we don't have a lot of squeaking noises going on, and typically that happens because moisture gets trapped inside of here, in between the bushing and the bar, and we get that really loud squeaking noise. So the lubricant is going to prevent that. So you do want to make sure you're wearing gloves. We'll take a good amount, and you just want to make sure you line the entire inside of the bushing with that lubricant. Now they're split bushings, so we just want to open them up, and right in the little curve here on each side, we'll put our bushing in place, and then you can always just take the excess, kind of put it around the bushing, again preventing that squeaking from happening. But then we want to take our clamp, and it's going to fit right over the top of the bushing. We're going to do that for both of our bushings. Again, you just want to make sure you put the bushing in that little flat section on either side of the middle here. Now the bar is rather large, so I do suggest getting an extra set of hands to help you lift it up. But we're going to be taking these bushing clamps and going right to that shock mount to mount it up to where those two bolts are. So we'll lift up the sway bar, make sure those bolts pass through the brackets. And then on the top one, we want to put a flat washer over the bolt. then we'll take a 3/8 nut, and you want to get it at least loosely threaded on one of the bolts on each side. That way it'll hold the bar up. We don't have to worry about it falling down. You get a couple threads on there, make sure it's not cross-threaded, and it'll hold itself. Then we can work on getting the rest of the hardware in. Now on the bottom, it's going to be the same nut that we're going to use, but we want to grab another one of those washers that has a cut section in it, so it'll actually fit a little bit better around the clamp here. And we'll loosely get those bolts started as well. Now once we have all the bolts in place on our shock mounts here, we're going to grab a 9/16 socket and a 9/16 wrench, and we'll tighten up that top hex bolt. Once we have that one tightened up, we're going to need to tighten up the bottom one. Now obviously we can have that 9/16 wrench or socket on the bottom here, but that button head screw is not going to work with a 9/16 wrench. The bottom bolt, we're going to use a 7/32 Allen bit and a 9/16 wrench to hold the nut. And once we get all the bolts tight over here, we'll move over to the other side and do the same thing. Now that we have all the bolts tight on the lower shock mounts, you can see that we can still move the sway bar, which is a good thing, but now we need to get our shocks bolted back in place. So we'll take our factory hardware. Again, you want to make sure you put that washer on each side, pass it through the eyelet, make sure it goes through the shock. Now it will get a little bit tight, and you can either use a wrench, a hammer, pretty much whatever you have. Just make sure you tap it through, it comes out the other side. And once it's all the way through, we'll put our washer and the nut back in place. We'll do that on both sides. Then we use that same 1/8" wrench and socket and tighten everything back up. So now we want to grab our shackle mount. One side will be kind of forked open, we'll have two tabs. The other side is going to have an eyelet with a bushing around it. We want to grab the eyelet with the bushing around it. It's going to go right through the frame bracket that we installed in the very beginning. We're going to grab one of the large bolts. You want to make sure this is coming from the outside going in. And it may be a little bit of a tight fit because of the leaf springs. And if it's too tight for you to get the bolt in there without getting around the leaf spring like that, you may have to either lower or lift the back end of the motorhome using those leveling jacks just a little bit more. We'll pass our bolt through the opening of the bracket and see if we can sneak it in past the leaf spring. If not, again, we'll either lift or lower the motorhome so we can get the bolt to clear right here. So we went ahead and lowered our motorhome all the way down to the ground and retracted the leveling jacks all the way. Now you can see we have plenty of room to get our shackle mount in place. So we'll line it up, take our bolt, again coming from the outside going in. Just let it hang by the bolt for now and loosely put in the lock nut. Then we can take our sway bar. We're just going to rotate it up to where the holes line up with our shackle mount and the end of the sway bar itself. And again, we'll grab another one of the long, large bolts. Make sure it goes all the way through. And then use another lock nut to secure everything down. Now again, you just want to make sure that you are coming from the outside, putting the bolt in. And then we'll go to the other side and put the rest of the hardware in the same combination over on there. Now we can go ahead and tighten up our shackle mounts on the bottom as well as on the top. I'm going to grab yourself a 24mm wrench and socket, or you can use a 15/16 inch wrench and socket. But when we do tighten these up, we just want to tighten them up enough to where everything's going to make contact. We don't really want to start cranking down on these because we'll end up crushing the bushing and possibly damaging the shackle itself. So again, we'll just use a 24 or 15/16 inch wrench, and we'll just snug it up to where all the hardware is going to touch. We'll repeat that for all of our other hardware, then we can come back and torque it down to the specified amount in the instructions. And once you have all your bolts tightened down and torqued, if you haven't already, you want to lower your motorhome off the leveling jacks and give it a quick test drive. Then you want to double check all the tightness and torque of the bolts. With all that being said, again, I'm Rob here at etrailer.com. That'll finish up your look at the Roadmaster rear anti-sway bar on our 2019 Coachmen Mirada Motorhome.